LeBron James is the greatest player in the history of the Cleveland Cavaliers. There's not much point in arguing it because, like gravity or the fact that 1 plus 1 equals 2, it's pretty much self-evident. The Cavaliers have been to the NBA Finals exactly 5 times, and LeBron was there for all of them. They've had 2 seasons where one of their players won the MVP, which were both LeBron. He's got twice as many All-Star appearances as any other player. He's got 8 of their 9 first-team All-NBA selections ever. He's one of their 2 players that have been voted Rookie of the Year, and he's the only Cavalier to ever have been named NBA Player of the Month, which he did 25 times. And most importantly of all, he was the centerpiece and leader of the team that won the franchise's only NBA title in 2016. LeBron is the greatest Cleveland Cavalier of all time, and it's not even close. But unlike most players who reach that type of status with the franchise, LeBron's career with the Cavs wasn't done all in one go. His time with the Cavaliers was very famously split into 2 parts, with 4 very successful years with his friends in Miami occupying the space in between. And the LeBron that came back from Miami in 2014 was very different from the one that made the decision to leave. He was a more well-rounded player. His post-game had improved, his three-point numbers were up, and he was a better leader. And that showed pretty immediately, because in his second stint with the Cavs, LeBron and the rest of that team hit the ground running. They made the finals that season, equaling the best finish of any of LeBron's Cavs teams in his first 8 seasons with the team. They made 3 more after that, including the one that brought them the title in 2016, cementing the fact that LeBron's second go-round in Cleveland was substantially more successful than the first. But on that point, one of the things that's always fascinated me about LeBron's career is how little the Cavs managed to accomplish in that first run. Sure, they managed to get back to being a playoff team and even grabbed a couple of 1 seeds, but each time, they were taken out by teams that either had much more talent or a more coherent identity, or both. And just looking at some of those rosters, it's honestly amazing that they even got that far. In 8 years with the team, only 2 players, Zydrunas Ilgauskas in 2005 and Mo Williams in 2009, made All-Star teams in the same season as LeBron. They had guys like Sasha Pavlovich and Boobie Gibson starting games for them in the 2007 finals against the Spurs. And when you think about it like that, it's no wonder they got swept. We talk about team building a lot on this channel, but most of the time, it's in a positive way. But the early LeBron Cavs, in my opinion, are an example of what not to do. And figuring out how they got to that point takes some unpacking. The Cavs landing LeBron was a certified lightning strike. Not so much in the sense that they got lucky with the number 1 overall pick. They were the worst team in the league in 2003 and earned those high lottery odds the old-fashioned way. But getting the number 1 pick when they did was absolutely crucial. LeBron was a gift from above, but unfortunately, getting a generational talent doesn't mean as much if he comes into a franchise that's been mismanaged for years. Had even a couple of choices gone slightly differently, either on draft night or near the trade deadline, LeBron might have never needed to leave Cleveland in the first place. But as we all know, that is not what ended up happening. These guys were so close, and yet also so far away, and the way it all went down makes for an absolutely fascinating case study. When it comes to team building in the NBA, you can basically do it through 3 main avenues: the draft, trades, or free agency. And even though they won the lottery of all lotteries in getting LeBron, which could have easily set them up for multiple championships, the early stage Cavs summarily failed at all 3. Before we get too critical of how the Cavs handled their draft strategy, there is one thing I want to point out. It's a pet peeve of mine when I hear people talk about how teams missed out on drafting certain players. Because yeah, it's not a great look when you draft a guy like DeJuan Wagner over Amari Stoudemire or Caron Butler, in hindsight. But even if they had, there's no guarantee that those guys would have come to Cleveland and turned into the same player. Situations matter, and in a hypothetical world where the Cavs draft Joe Johnson in 2001 instead of Desana Diop, they're probably in a better position by the time LeBron comes around, but who's to say that Johnson turns into the 7-time All-Star he became? It's a dangerous game to play because there's no telling what could or would have happened had things gone differently. And this isn't a multiverse situation where we could ever actually find out the answer. But that being said, aside from picking LeBron in 2003, which was as close to a no-brainer as you'll probably ever see with these things, the Cavs did not draft well before or during LeBron's first tenure with the team. They had 6 straight drafts with a pick in the top 10, a prime opportunity to get some talent on a roster that desperately needed it. And somehow, they came away with basically nothing. Like, if you look at the 2007 finals roster, none of those lottery picks are on there. That is a lot of draft capital to spend, only to not have any of it pay off when you need it the most. I already mentioned Hassani Diop in 2001 and Dewan Wagner in 2002, neither of which really panned out for one reason or another. Jamal Crawford and Andre Miller were good, but both of them had already been traded by the time LeBron came around. Taking Luke Jackson in 2004 didn't work either, and by the time they got to 2006 or 2008, the team's record was good enough for them not to be in the running for the talent at the top of the draft. No offense to Shannon Brown or J.J. Hickson, but it's typically a lot harder to draft a starter from that part of the board, and the Cavs were no exception to that. All of that adds up to one of the most important pillars of team building, probably the most important pillar when it comes to sustainability, basically coming back with nothing outside of LeBron. And that's essentially what you have when you look at that roster in the 2007 finals, too. The fruit of all those missed opportunities. They had chances in 2001, 2002, and 2004 to really build a core for LeBron to step into, instead of having to be the whole thing himself. And if they had hit even once on any of those, things could have been very different. And you may have noticed that I left out a couple of years in that mix, namely 2005 and 2007. That's because the Cavs didn't have first-round picks in either of those seasons, because they traded them away to acquire Wesley Person and Yuri Welsh. And if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, those don't really sound like the kind of players you should give up for a first-round pick, you'd be completely right. In addition to being pretty lousy drafters, the Cavaliers have also made some pretty tremendously dumb trades in their team's history, especially when it comes to giving away first-round picks. Those picks in 2005 and 2007 wouldn't have been super high or anything, but had they played their cards right, the Cavs could have gotten Danny Granger or David Lee or someone to take the scoring load off of LeBron. But instead, they couldn't do anything because those picks belonged to other teams. And as confusing as some of the trades the Cavs made were, the ones they didn't end up making might be even worse. Because if you can't draft enough high-caliber talent, you've got to try and bring in some players from somewhere else. And that's usually where trades can help quite a bit. But if you don't have any pieces to make trades with, like good young players or high draft picks, there's not a whole lot you can do on that front either. And by the time LeBron and the Cavs were ready to contend, which was around the 2005-2006 season, that's exactly where they found themselves. While teams like the Celtics and the Lakers were able to leverage their assets for players like Kevin Garnett or Pau Gasol and ended up winning championships because of it, the Cavs couldn't. That might have also had something to do with the fact that no one wanted to sign long-term in Cleveland after getting traded there, but we'll cover that more in a minute. It wasn't like the Cavs didn't try to make big deals. They went after guys like Amari Stoudemire and Vince Carter pretty hard, but none of those ended up happening. You can make an argument that the best trade the Cavs made in LeBron's first tenure was for Mo Williams. And as much as I love Mo as an Alabama fan, if you're trying to win an NBA title, that just isn't good enough. So if you aren't drafting good players, and that's at least part of the reason that you can't trade for good players either, then there's really only one option left, and that's to try and entice people to your team in free agency. And this, somehow, more than the other two things we've already talked about, is where the early LeBron Cavs really swung and missed. Before this team could really even get off the ground, the Cavs had already given big contracts to both Ira Newble and Donyell Marshall in free agency. The team overpaid for both of them, only to have their production drop off a cliff pretty much as soon as they pulled on a Cavs jersey. Those guys weren't ever expected to be LeBron's second in command, but good teams find ways to get value even from their role players. Especially in a market like Cleveland, you've got to get bang for your buck anytime you throw that kind of cash around. Assuming, of course, that your cash is enough to get someone to actually sign for you in the first place, which did become a bit of a problem. Let's go ahead and address the Joakim Noah-sized elephant in the room. If you made a list of NBA cities that could be classified as free agent destinations, Cleveland would probably not be on there. So the Cavs front office were already at a disadvantage compared with markets like Los Angeles or Miami, but they also made plenty of mistakes on their own. For instance, GM Jim Paxson thought he had a handshake agreement on a long-term deal with Carlos Boozer in 2004, only for Boozer to sign with the Jazz for way more money instead. Boozer went on to make 2 All-Star teams and make it to the conference finals, coincidentally losing to the same Spurs team that would end up beating the crap out of LeBron and the Cavs in the finals, but regardless, in letting Boozer walk, Jim Paxson and the Cavs front office looked like a bunch of goofballs. And it wouldn't be the last time. When Danny Ferry replaced Paxson in 2005, he came in with an eye on signing the guy to be the Robin to LeBron's Batman, and they had a couple of legitimate targets to try and fill that role with. Ray Allen, then of the Seattle Sonics, and Michael Redd from the Bucks were both available, and the Cavs were hot on their trail. Joe Johnson was also a restricted free agent that summer, but didn't seem like the Cavs were all that interested. He went to Atlanta, turned into an absolute animal, and in hindsight, not pursuing him at least a little bit was almost certainly a mistake. But despite throwing the kitchen sink at Allen and Red and having Joe Johnson ready and willing to change teams, the Cavs ended up with none of them. Allen re-signed with the Sonics and Red re-signed with the Bucks, and in a panic, the Cavs threw a ton of money at Larry Hughes, who, like Ira Newble and Donnell Marshall before him, regressed immediately. When given the chance to sign a big name to pair with LeBron, thereby correcting some of their numerous mistakes from the past, the Cavs were forced to settle, and all the money they threw at Hughes hamstrung them for the next few years. And over those next few seasons, at a time when their team building should have been reaching its apex, all of those mistakes showed. Conventional wisdom tells us that lightning only has to strike once for a team to be set for the next 10 years or so. If the stars line up in just the right way, and the basketball gods decide that it's your team's time to win the lottery, literally and figuratively, then all of your troubles will just be over. But if nothing else, LeBron's first stint with the Cavs proves that conventional wisdom to be completely, woefully incorrect. For a team to be given the best player of a generation for the better part of a decade, only to come away with a single conference title, there has to be an absolute laundry list of missed opportunities along the way. You would almost have to be trying not to win to make that happen, and honestly, if you just told me the moves they made and how they turned out, you wouldn't have to work that hard to convince me that that's exactly what the Cavs were doing. Thankfully, for him and for everybody else, LeBron got a second try with the franchise that drafted him, and got to come home and redeem the failures of that doomed first run. But those Cavs teams are a cautionary tale, and most of all, they teach us one important lesson. If you fail to build a team well and are working against yourself in pretty much every area possible, it doesn't matter how lucky you get. One strike of lightning doesn't make up for a decade or more of complete and utter drought. Hello to all my fellow students out there. The NBA Finals have arrived, which means that it's one of my favorite times of the entire year. I don't want to toot my own horn too much here, but I did make videos about how good both of the teams that made it in are. If you like this video, do me a favor and give it a like, or even subscribe to the channel to get more content like it. I'd love to hear your pick for who's going to win the finals in the comments. Or if you have an idea for a future video you want me to do, you can put that in there as well. We'll be putting out videos every Friday from now on, so I hope to see you back here at the same time next week. Until then, I'm Will. Happy NBA Finals, everybody!